First I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak. This is a really great opportunity. Normally when I speak about this research, I'm talking to people who focus primarily on migration, so I'm thinking as an urban geographer, so it's really nice to sort of see the reverse. The other weird thing about normally when I talk about Nashville, nobody's been there, so I can just say whatever I want, but Amada has actually done a lot of research, so I had to make sure that I keep my story straight. So what I want to talk about today is sort of the relationship between old maps and new neighbors. And the material I'd like to present today really draws from some broader work on the politics of immigrant incorporation in Nashville, Tennessee, which is a city that's a part of the trend of immigrant settlement and non-traditional destinations that we've seen really since the late 1990s. Now the study itself was largely qualitative with about 18 months of field work, primarily in Nashville schools and neighborhoods, and I'm happy to talk about some of the other parts of the study at the end, primarily between 2006 and 2008. And the part that I want to discuss today really comes from the work in neighborhoods in southeast Nashville, where most Latino immigrants, as well as much of the city's refugee population, settled in the 2000s, which really sort of through the 2000s, we saw the continuation of the rapid growth that we had seen in the late 1990s. Now, Southeast Nashville historically has been a white working class part of the city with smaller pockets of black settlement throughout. And the parts I want to talk about today are Woodbine, which is where the red arrow is, which is kind of platted in the 20s and 30s and really boomed in the 50s and 60s. And then Antioch, which is the southernmost part of that quadrant where the blue arrows are, which really saw kind of explosive commercial and residential growth from the 1970s on. So by the 2000s, Woodbine was being described as Nashville's Little Mexico, and Antioch was being described sometimes sort of pejoratively as Hispaniac, or as an area with out-of-control growth, out-of-control youth, and too many poor people to make it a site of good investment for homeowners. Just to give you a sense of what the urban landscape looks like, it's sort of your typical strip development where some of what we've already heard about today of small businesses either owned by Latino immigrants or focused on Latino used tires. And again, just to give you a sense of how the landscape has changed. So one of the book's main arguments is that the politics of immigration, especially in new destinations, can't be understood without examining its articulations with dominant versions of local history that shape understandings and the institutional and social incorporation of Latino immigrants. Most new destinations lack recallable histories of immigrant settlement, especially in the South, and this absence really impacts how long-term residents, key institutions, and new immigrants themselves interpret and respond to demographic change and urban transformation. So in these places, elements of local history, as well as the local urban landscape, shape immigrant incorporation and exclusions in ways that we need to pay more attention to. And one of the things I think you'll see here is a very different context of reception in these new destinations in the South that kind of build on what Stanton was mentioning. So what I want to examine here are some of the ways that historical geographies of neighborhood in Nashville were drawn into the wider politics of immigrant incorporation. So what happens when the local past becomes a way to make sense of and intervene in a changing presence that includes yet exceeds immigrant settlement. So the starting point in thinking about how immigration impacts neighborhoods is the question, the neighborhood according to whom? In Southeast Nashville, long-term black and white residents and Latino immigrants didn't see or understand neighborhood in the same way. So many long-term residents describe their current neighborhood by drawing on features from the 1940s to the 1960s, an era that was really central to how they saw a neighborhood, even as features from that time were fading in the built environments. Now, many Latino immigrants, by contrast, were unaware of either the historic or the current names of the places where they lived. Most Latino immigrants, even those who'd been in Nashville for several years, described neighborhood as Nashville or Davidson County and jumped from the intimate spaces of neighborhood to the sprawling scale of the urban. So in Southeast Nashville, residents living side by side made sense of the places where they all ostensibly lived by calling on different moments in its history and operationalizing different scales to describe it. So they both did and didn't live in the same neighborhood. Now, a lot of studies point to the appropriation of social space as sort of a key means of empowerment for immigrants, but this appropriation becomes particularly salient when it takes place within sites that are historically meaningful to long-term residents. So when the spatial manifestations of immigrant settlement take place on the grounds of key historical events for long-term residents, the politics of immigrant incorporation and neighborhood change get caught up in the politics of nostalgia, and immigrant reception becomes inseparable from local recollections of time past. So in the absence of a clear way to make sense of immigration in new destinations, the spaces within which immigrants interacted with local memories became especially potent in the wider politics of immigration. Now in Nashville, a handful of historical events helped long-term residents frame and respond to neighborhood change, including immigrant settlement. And I'll discuss just one here, and that's the advent of busing children in Nashville from the 1970s to the late 1990s to create racial balance in public schools. As many long-term residents explained, busing, quote, fragmented their neighborhood, that was a word we heard over and over, and began to change the dispersed friends to Davidson County's rural fringes and started the area's downhill slide. Now, busing, though, did more than explain the roots of neighborhood change in Southeast Nashville, because several long-term residents also used their experiences with busing in the 70s to frame their responses to Latino immigrants in the 2000s. So Carl, for example, stressed that to understand how immigrant settlement had changed his neighborhood, you've got to go back before that. In our city, it goes back to school busing. Whether you're for it or against it, it destroyed our neighborhood's relationship with our children. So understanding immigration's impact on the neighborhood in the 2000s meant understanding bus's effect on the link between neighborhood and schools in the 1970s. So neighborhood change through immigration only made sense in the wider context of busing, right? A key shift in the relationship between race and space in the city, and one with which these white working class residents were intimately familiar. Now, part of busing's role in narrating immigrant settlement in Nashville was bound up in with his class politics. So court-ordered desegregation of public institutions like schools, we all know, were designed to address racial inequalities between black and whites, but they also sometimes aggravated class divisions among whites. Some white residents had the economic and social mobility to move out of bus neighborhoods or put their kids in private schools, while other white residents, especially those in Southeast Nashville, lacked the class mobility to leave and had cultural ties to the neighborhood that made abandoning them hard. Thus, busing became a defining moment for their neighborhood and its sense of community, in large part because they felt they could do little about it. Now, this memory of busing as an imposition offered a way to interpret the area's current condition, especially immigrant settlement. So across entry, these long-term residents used their experiences with racial transitions in schools through busing to explain their encounters with ethnic change through immigrant settlement in their neighborhood. In both cases, residents stressed they had no control over the realities of increasing racial and ethnic diversity. As Carl explained at a neighborhood meeting where the topic of immigration came up, in the 1960s and 70s, when school integration began, he had to learn to accept life with black residents and, quote, that was fine. Now, in the 2000s, he was learning again, this time to accept immigrants in his neighborhoods. Now, not all long-term residents took such a kind of conciliatory response to immigrant settlement, however. Just as school desegregation led some working-class white residents to believe that their urban spaces had been, quote, stolen, some long-term residents felt that immigrant settlement constituted an unwanted development. In Brian's words, people in Southeast Nashville were, quote, tired of the Hispanic influence, end quote. Not only or even primarily because it changed the neighborhood, but because it took place in ways beyond their control and in ways that wealthier parts of the city didn't experience. So in response to this sense that immigrant settlement, along with other forces of urban transformation, had really changed the neighborhood they once knew, some long-term residents sought ways to bring that neighborhood back. So in what remains of my talk, I want to highlight one way that they did so by remapping old neighborhoods to redefine a contemporary reality at odds with how they understood the area and its meaning in Nashville. Now, this remapping took place in various forms across Southeast Nashville, but it was particularly clear in Antioch, which is where those blue arrows are again. That southernmost part of Southeast Nashville had experienced rapid residential and commercial growth since the 1970s. So in 2007, an old community in Antioch was remapped as a new space. Now this old/new community was Cane Ridge, which had been a rural, tight-knit community in the midst of greater Antioch with roots in the early 19th century. Now, over time, Cane Ridge was engulfed by Antioch and its expansion, but it wasn't forgotten by long-term residents who recalled its history fondly and often. So in 2007, a group of them got together and formally remapped Cane Ridge as a neighborhood. So mail could be sent to Cane Ridge, and importantly, property within it was listed as Cane Ridge and not Antioch. With small road signs marking its boundaries, Cane Ridge became for its recreators a means and a space through which to intervene in Antioch's image as a place of crime, low value, and immigrant settlement. Its new borders were designed, in the words of an African-American resident familiar with the campaign, to, quote, run out the riffraff in Cane Ridge by quite literally running its borders around them. Just to orient you again, we're in that southernmost part of southeast Nashville. Pay attention to that dip at the top of the map that we'll come back to. So Cane Ridge in its new form was not solely or even mainly a response to immigrant settlement. An important local symbol for older residents, Cane Ridge meant something to those who had lived and grown up in it, and this meaning didn't necessarily link to an immigrant presence. Instead, Cane Ridge's identity was grounded in a shared history of schools, churches, and community institutions, and reproduced through very strong claims to place for its residents and regular events like monthly gatherings at the old Cane Ridge School. Because Antioch had, quote, a bad rap across Nashville, and because its borders were increasingly stretched to include areas that long-term residents didn't consider to be part of Antioch, Cane Ridge was resurrected to trace the line between homeowners and, quote, everything else in this changing community. And this is a very typical narrative that we heard when we would ask, you know, where do Latinos live in this area? And long-term residents would often pull parts of the city that actually weren't in Antioch to identify where in this area. So its borders kind of got stretched in all these ways that changed its meaning. So concerned that they were increasingly, quote, painted with a broad brush that makes homeowners and renters, community members, and, quote, riffraff across Antioch, Cane Ridge's designers created a new boundary for an old community that, quote, came to us gradually, according to one organizer. What emerged in the process was a map designed to include those residents for whom Cane Ridge was meaningful and to exclude those for whom it was presumed not to be. Tapping into wider discourses of immigrants as, quote, not having a sense of ownership in the neighborhood, as a Nashville police officer put it in 2006 in an interview, Cane Ridge's designers drew its boundaries to exclude strip development and nearby apartment complexes where, quote, Cane Ridge doesn't mean anything to the residents. Now, this process of bounding Cane Ridge is quite clear in notes from an interview with two older women who lived all their lives in Cane Ridge. And here, the, quote, other that some Cane Ridge residents feared would swallow their neighborhood and that sat nameless just outside its borders is quite clear. With Cane Ridge as an official place, quote, we won't disappear amidst the change that threatened to engulf Cane Ridge and its way of life. Blunter than other residents involved in this remapping, one organizer defined Cane Ridge by property ownership. The quote starts after the renters, and it includes owners paying taxes. When I asked him where Hispanics lived, he, like many, traced spaces beyond Cane Ridge. Main corridors in Antioch, apartments by a local mall, and the main strip in Woodbine, again drawing sites outside Antioch into its immigrant geography. When I asked what those areas were called, quote, just Antioch. So Cane Ridge thus became a means and a space to intervene in and limit the sense that Antioch was everywhere that crime was present and that Latino immigrants were everywhere that constituted Antioch. In the words of an organizer, recreating Cane Ridge was, quote, a way to preserve our identity against an unnamed presence all over Antioch. So in Antioch, the areas of high density where many Latino immigrants settled were the spatial other to Cane Ridge's small farms and subdivisions. The residential structures that allowed Cane Ridge's creator to mark the lines between it and just Antioch. So what you're looking at here is the small sign I showed you is literally behind me. And these are apartment complexes and sort of higher urban density. They're literally just beyond Cane Ridge's borders. And if we go back to this map, they're that area that was carved out. So these areas beyond Cane Ridge's borders were also the unfamiliar present that remapping Cane Ridge was designed to overwrite. Immigrant settlement, the growth of large apartment complexes, and the general suburbanization of Antioch problematized what being from this area meant for long-term residents. When that shared past was used to remap Cane Ridge, immigrants were excluded in both the meaning and the spatial extent of the neighborhood. Now, Cane Ridge's remapping had material consequences across Nashville. So in 2008, Nashville opened its first high school in many years, Cane Ridge High. Now, because it was close to Antioch's already overcrowded high school, Cane Ridge High forced a very contentious rezoning debate and abandonment of the last vestiges of busing and efforts toward racial balance in Nashville schools. Now, as the debate was explained to me, it, quote, all started in Cane Ridge, which itself all started with Antioch's demographic transformation. And through this link between new school and old neighborhood, past and present practices of racial exclusion came together in really striking ways. So what are the implications of addressing new neighbors with old maps? What does it mean when long-term residents frame an immigrant arrival through the lens of busing and see both as externally imposed changes that led to loss? In groups with groups living cheek by jowl, when they see neighborhood in different ways, how and where do they create community? In Nashville, answers to these questions involve the articulation of the politics of immigration and the politics of the past. Deeb Sosa and Mendez-Bickham argue that in new destinations, social boundaries are constructed by key actors to limit Latino residents' abilities to become part of the local community and to experience social belonging. Such borders, however, also assume spatial forms through the mobilization of local histories that are invisible to immigrants yet shape their ability to join dominant definitions of community and place. As immigrant settlement transformed Southeast Nashville's urban landscape and social fabric in the 2000s, long-term residents called on historical geographies to interpret and in some cases to remap the present. Now, these resurrected versions of the local past were largely invisible to Latino immigrants who arrived in Nashville in the 90s and were themselves unfamiliar with the city's history. So in this way, the collision of old maps and new neighbors across Nashville produced an immigrant exclusion that in some ways was inadvertent but potent, that was invisible to Latino immigrants, yet shaping their claims to place. At the same time, Latino immigrants themselves charted new maps of community that were hard for long-term residents to see. So when asked about neighborhood relations in Southeast Nashville, a pastor for a Latino congregation explained that Latino residents would have, quote, community among their own family and their friends more than in neighborhood. So in this way, Latino residents made friends at work, they saw their neighborhood as including friends who lived in other cities, and they connected their home in Nashville to sites across Latin America through remittances, videos, and phone calls. And these local and also translocal projects created new definitions and maps of community even as they remained invisible to long-term residents. So in this way, both immigrants and long-term residents understood and enacted neighborhood in ways illegible to the other group. Nonetheless, these two groups increasingly lived side by side, and within the social spaces that they shared and amidst their competing maps of neighborhood, some new and old residents unknowingly mirrored each other in their feelings about life in Nashville. Immigrants who couldn't see the past that was the bedrock of long-term residents' understanding of place, and long-term residents who couldn't understand a present defined by Latino claims to place, met in the intimate spaces of neighborhood where they both claimed home even as they both felt out of place. Our understandings of these sites, their revitalizations, and the politics they produce have to account for these competing yet overlapping definitions of place, neighborhood, and home, and the ways they articulate with mobilizations of history that sometimes exclude new immigrants from dominant definitions of place. Because in most new destinations, immigration has only recently become a local phenomenon, long-term residents often struggle to narrate it in relation to the past. And here's a difference from some of the sites that we saw in the previous session. The kinds of interpretive frameworks that you see in places with long histories of immigration are just not available in Nashville. With no recallable history of immigrant settlement, with little sense of how their city or neighborhood became attractive to immigrants, and with no obvious way to place immigrant settlement in local histories, long-term residents in new destinations, especially at the very beginning, make sense of immigrant settlement through a local lens that draws on specific historical events in their neighborhoods. In doing so, the narratives they create can reinforce immigrants' locations as outsiders and exclude them from these local redefinitions of place. Fertel and Nibbs suggest that in new destinations, an anxiety over American identity sits at the center of negative reactions to an immigrant presence. Such anxiety over how long-term residents' community has been changing, however, are as much about the ways that immigrant settlement forces a reconsideration of how local communities are remembered as they are about material change or generalized American identity. In Nashville, as immigration transformed local landscapes, long-term residents responded to a loss that didn't even register as a presence for new immigrants. Both immigrants and long-term residents were invested in making or maintaining a place in Southeast Nashville. They did so, however, by understanding the neighborhood and its boundaries in different ways, inhibiting immigrant incorporation by quite literally working with two different maps.